My name is Nadia Voss, and I was 31 years old the morning my father-in-law slid a folded sheet of paper across the breakfast table and told me to be gone by the end of the month. That was the same week my husband, Gregor, had packed a single duffel bag, told me he needed space to figure himself out, and driven away without looking back at the house. His father, Henryk, waited exactly 4 days before he sat down across from me at that table. He set a coffee mug to his left. He folded his hands. And then he said, "This is his family's property. You were always a guest." I looked at the paper. I looked at him. I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't ask a single question. I went upstairs, packed one bag, just one, and I was in my car by 9:15. What Henryk did not know, what no one in that family had known for the better part of 3 years, was that a document existed. A quiet document. The kind that sits in a county records office, filed correctly, notarized twice, and utterly unremarkable until the moment someone needs it. 40 days later, a title officer knocked on Henryk Voss's front door. I wasn't there to see his face. I didn't have to be. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the shouting. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and leave a comment below. I read every single one. There are houses that feel like yours and houses that only ever feel borrowed. The Voss property on Eldermark Road had always felt like the second kind, not because it was unwelcoming, exactly, but because Henryk Voss had a way of making sure you understood the order of things. The furniture had been his mother's. The photograph arrangement on the stairwell wall followed a logic that predated me by 40 years. And whenever a decision needed to be made about the house, a repair, a paint color, which contractor to call, Henryk made it. Gregor deferred. And I learned in the quiet, patient way that you learn things in a marriage that is slowly teaching you its actual shape, to say nothing at all. I want to be honest about who I was when I moved into that house, because it matters for everything that comes after. I was 27. I had a job I was good at. I managed accounts for a mid-sized civil engineering firm, the kind of work that requires you to track contracts, cross-reference filing dates, and notice when something in a document doesn't match what someone told you verbally. I was precise by training and by nature. I kept records. I kept my mouth shut in rooms where speaking would cost more than it returned. And I had, at that point, been married to Gregor Voss for 14 months. We had moved into the house on Eldermark Road because it made financial sense. That was the reason we gave each other, and it was true as far as it went. Gregor's firm had just gone through a contraction, not his fault, broader industry pressure, and the rent on our apartment downtown had been climbing every renewal cycle. Henryk had offered the lower level of the house, a walkout unit that had its own entrance and a small deck that faced the back garden. He framed it as temporary. Gregor said 6 months, maybe 12. I agreed because I could see the math clearly, and because I believed, and this is the part that I look back on with something that sits in my sternum like a small cold stone, I believed that Henryk's reserve was just his way. That underneath it he was glad to have us there.
I was wrong about that.
But I didn't find out in any single dramatic moment. I found out the way you find out most true things about people. Incrementally, quietly, over the course of ordinary Tuesday afternoon conversations that I only understood in retrospect. Henryk Voss was 64 when we moved in. He was a tall man, still straight-backed, with large hands that he kept clasped behind him when he walked through the house, as though inspecting something. He had retired 2 years earlier from a career in commercial property management, which, I came to understand, meant that he thought about real estate the way some people think about religion, as a system of absolute rules with clear hierarchies and a strong emphasis on who held title. His wife, Gregor's mother Marta, had died when Gregor was 19. There were no other children. And the house on Eldermark Road, a 4-bedroom craftsman on a half-acre lot in a quiet part of the city, bought in the late 90s, paid off by the time we arrived, was, in Henryk's cosmology, the physical proof that his life had amounted to something. He referenced it often. Not boastfully, but with a proprietor's careful attention. The gutters need resealing before October. The back fence is the neighbor's responsibility. I've documented it. The furnace is original, but it's been maintained correctly. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I liked him, at first.
I want to say that plainly.
There was something reassuring about a man who knew exactly where every document was and could tell you the maintenance history of a water heater from memory. In my line of work, that kind of precision is a virtue. I extended it to him as a virtue without asking whether it came with conditions. The first condition I learned was this: Henryk did not consider me a permanent fixture. I don't mean that he was rude about it. He wasn't. He said please and thank you. He complimented my cooking twice in 3 years, which I later calculated was his median rate of complimenting anything. But there was a quality to the way he spoke about the house and its future. When Gregor takes this over, I want the original molding preserved. The kind of family that buys a place like this, they'll want the original molding. That placed me slightly outside the frame. I was Gregor's wife, but I was not, in Henryk's private accounting, a Voss. And in his world, that meant something specific. I noticed. I filed it under things I could not change and did not speak about, which in those years was a substantial category. I should tell you about the refinancing because that is where the story actually begins, even though neither of us knew it at the time. It was the spring of my second year in the house. Interest rates had shifted, and a colleague of mine, someone in the mortgage side of an adjacent industry, mentioned that the spread was favorable for anyone with equity and a clean title history. I mentioned it to Gregor. Gregor mentioned it to Henryk. Henryk, to my mild surprise, agreed to look into it. What followed was 6 weeks of paperwork that I largely managed because Gregor's schedule was demanding and because I was, as I said, precise by training. I gathered the documentation, corresponded with the loan officer, tracked the title search, and sat with the closing attorney for the better part of a Wednesday afternoon going through the instrument by instrument. The attorney, a quiet woman named Delphine Sarr, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and spoke in the measured syllables of someone who has explained the same concepts several thousand times without losing patience, paused at one point and looked up at me. "You're the co-applicant of record," she said. "Given that, we'd recommend including you on the deed. It's not required, but it's standard practice for married co-applicants, and it protects both parties." I looked at Gregor. He shrugged in the way he shrugged at most things that required a considered answer. "Sure," he said. "Makes sense." Henryk was not at that closing. He had declined to attend, saying he trusted Gregor to handle it, which translated, I now believe, to he had reviewed the summary documents, confirmed the rate and terms, and did not feel the need to sit through 2 hours of signature pages. He was not present when Delphine Sarr amended the deed instrument to include my name alongside Gregor's. He did not review the final recorded document. He received a copy by mail, in a manila envelope from the county recorder's office, that I strongly suspect he filed without opening. I know he filed it without opening it because of what happened 3 years later. The marriage had not been failing dramatically. I want to be clear about that, because the story is better understood if you know that it was failing quietly, in the way that things fail when two people stop being curious about each other and start treating cohabitation as a logistical arrangement. Gregor was not unkind. He was absent. There is a difference, and the difference matters because absent feels like your own fault in a way that unkind does not. By the time he packed that duffel bag, I had already been living at a slight interior distance from the marriage for most of a year. I had my work. I had a small group of friends, women I'd known since before Gregor, who had been patient with my incremental disappearance into the Voss household and were gracious about receiving me back in partial increments. I had a running habit that took me out of the house on Eldermark Road 5 mornings a week, which was, I think, the sanest thing I did during that entire period. When Gregor said he needed space, I said okay. When he said he wasn't sure what he wanted, I said I understood. When he drove away, and I stood in the front hall of that house, and felt the particular stillness of a space that had never quite been mine, I did not cry. Something shifted in my chest, a settling almost like a building after a tremor, and then I went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat with it. 4 days later, Henryk came downstairs. He waited until I had already poured a second cup. That is the detail I remember with the most precision. Not what he was wearing, not the exact light, but the fact that he waited until I had poured the second cup. As though he had been listening from the top of the stairs, and timed it. He sat down across from me. He set his own mug to his left. He folded his hands in the way he folded them when he was explaining something he considered settled. "I think we should talk about the practical side of things," he said. I said nothing. I waited. Gregor will need time. I'm not going to pretend I know how this ends. But in the meantime, and here he slid the paper across the table toward me. This is his family's property. You were always a guest here. I think it's cleaner if you have a timeline. The paper was a written notice. 30 days. It had been typed, not handwritten, which told me he had prepared it before sitting down. I looked at the paper. I looked at him. He held my gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the other party to accept it. 30 days is generous, he added. I wanted to be fair. I folded the paper. I put it in the pocket of my cardigan. I stood up, picked up my coffee, and said, "Thank you for letting me know." I went upstairs. I packed one bag, clothes, my laptop, the folder of personal documents I kept in the top drawer of the desk in our bedroom, my grandmother's watch, and the small framed print that had been mine before any of this. I left everything else exactly where it was. I did not leave a note. I texted Gregor a single line. "Your father gave me a 30-day notice. I'm leaving today." He read it. I could see the read receipt and did not respond. I was in my car and off Eldermark Road by 9:15. The next 6 weeks were, objectively, among the more clarifying of my life. I stayed with my friend Petra for the first 2 weeks. She had a spare room and an instinct for when to ask questions and when to simply put a plate of food in front of you and talk about something else entirely. I went to work every day. I ran every morning. I spoke with a lawyer, a woman named Clara Wren who specialized in property and family law and who had been recommended to me by a colleague, and I sat across from her in her office on a Thursday afternoon and told her what had happened. She listened. She asked 3 questions. Then she pulled up the county records portal on her desktop, typed in the address, and went quiet for a moment. "You're on the deed," she said. "I know," I said. "Has anyone contacted you about removing you?"
No.
She leaned back. She took off her reading glasses. "Then the notice is void. An owner can't be served a notice to vacate their own property. Henryk Voss has no legal standing to remove you. The question is what you want to do about it." I thought about that for a moment. "I don't want to move back in," I said. "That's your right. But you may want to establish that the property interest is recognized formally, particularly if there's any sale, refinancing, or transfer being contemplated. Without your signature, none of those can proceed." I thanked her. I left. I drove to Petra's and sat on her back steps in the early evening and thought about Henryk's face when he slid that paper across the table. The absolute certainty of it. The tidiness. "You were always a guest." Filed, settled, decided. I decided I would do nothing yet. I would wait. And I would let whatever was going to happen, happen. It happened on a Wednesday in late October. I learned about it in pieces. First from Clara, who called me that morning to say the county records office had flagged an attempted title transfer on the Eldermark Road property. Henryk had engaged a real estate attorney with the apparent intention of transferring the property into a sole ownership trust in his name only. Second, from the title company assigned to process the transfer, whose officer, a man named Douglas Featherstone, according to the email header, had pulled the existing deed during due diligence and found 2 names where the transfer application listed one. Douglas Featherstone did not call me first. He called his office's compliance coordinator. She sent a certified letter to the address of record, which was still Eldermark Road, requesting that both named owners confirm or contest the proposed transfer. When no response came from the second named owner, me, within the statutory window, Featherstone's office flagged the transfer as incomplete and initiated a formal title review. Part of that review required a notification visit. I know what happened at that visit because Clara told me, and because Featherstone, who was, as it turned out, a careful and methodical man who had been in the business for 22 years, documented the visit in writing and provided me a copy as the affected party of record. Henryk had not been alone when Featherstone arrived. Gregor was there. He had come back to Eldermark Road, not to reconcile with me. I had already understood that reconciliation was not coming, but to, as best I could determine, assist his father in the administrative mechanics of the transfer. There was also a man I did not know, described in Featherstone's notes as present at the premises, introduced as the family's real estate attorney. Featherstone rang the bell at 10:40 in the morning.
Henryk answered.
Featherstone introduced himself, explained that he was the assigned title officer on the pending transfer, and said he needed to go over a discrepancy in the deed instrument before the transfer could proceed. Henryk invited him in. They sat in the living room, the same room where I had eaten Sunday dinners for 3 years, where the furniture had been Henryk's mother's, where the photographs climbed the wall in their fixed and unalterable order. Gregor sat on the arm of the sofa. The family's attorney sat across from Featherstone. Featherstone opened his folder. He placed the deed on the coffee table. "This is the recorded instrument as it stands," he said. "Filed with the county 3 years ago, following a refinancing. This is the document that would need to be superseded for the transfer to proceed." He let them look at it. "I see 2 names on this deed," he said. "The transfer application lists one. I need to understand the basis for that discrepancy before we can move forward." Henryk looked at the deed. He looked at it for a long time. What Featherstone recorded in his notes, and what Clara read to me over the phone that afternoon while I sat at my desk at work with the phone pressed against my ear and my other hand very flat on the surface of my desk, was this. Homeowner appeared to be reviewing the deed instrument for the first time. He stated he was not aware of the second-named party's inclusion. He asked to speak with his attorney privately. Featherstone had waited in the hall. When they reconvened, the family's attorney said they would need additional time to review the instrument and determine their position. Featherstone confirmed that until both parties of record either consented to or formally contested the transfer, it could not proceed. He left his card. He drove away. I was not there. I was at my desk, with my hand flat on the surface, and a sound in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not relief, something older and quieter than either of those. Something like, "Of course." Clara filed the formal notice of my ownership interest with the county recorder's office that same week. It was a routine document, a statement of record, nothing dramatic. It did not initiate a lawsuit. It did not demand anything. It simply established, in writing, that I existed, that I had legal standing, and that any disposition of the Aldermark Road property required my signature. The calls began 3 days later. The first was from Gregor. I let it go to voicemail. He said he wanted to talk, that his father hadn't understood the deed situation, that he was sure they could figure something out. His voice had the careful modulation of someone who had prepared what they were going to say. I listened to the message twice. I did not call back. The second call was from a number I didn't recognize. It was Henryk. In 3 years of living in his house, Henryk Voss had never called my cell phone. I had his number because Gregor had put it in my contacts during the first month, in case of emergency. He had never used mine. I stared at the screen for the 4 rings it took to go to voicemail, and then I listened. Nadia. A pause. "This is Henryk. I think there may have been some confusion about the paperwork. I'd like to speak with you if you're willing. I think we can resolve this without getting attorneys further involved." His voice was steady. But underneath the steadiness there was something I had not heard from him before, a careful quality, a modulated quality, the voice of a man who has realized that a room he thought he owned has a wall he didn't account for. I did not call back. The third call was from Gregor's aunt, a woman named Bettina, whom I had met perhaps 6 times over the course of the marriage, who sent Christmas cards and asked about my work at family dinners with genuine seeming interest. She said she was calling just to check in, just to see how I was doing, and that she hoped we could all find a way through this that was good for everyone. I listened to that message 3 times, trying to locate the specific thing that made it worse than the others. I think it was the good for everyone. The implication that there existed an outcome that would be good for me and also conveniently resolve the problem I represented. I texted Clara. "The family is calling." She responded. "Expected. Don't engage without me present. You have no obligation to resolve anything on their timeline. I want to tell you what I did in the weeks that followed because I think it is the part of the story that people find hardest to believe and also the part one am most sure was right. I did nothing aggressive. I made no demands. I did not call a press conference or post anything online or drive to Aldermark Road and stand on the porch to make a point. I went to work. I ran in the mornings. I had dinner with Petra and with my friend Simone, who had known me since we were 22 and who said, when I told her the full story, Of course your name was on the deed. Of course it was. That is the most you thing I've ever heard. Clara and I had one formal meeting with Gregor and his attorney in mid-November. It lasted 40 minutes. Gregor's attorney presented a proposal. I would sign a quitclaim deed relinquishing my interest in the property. In exchange, I would receive a cash settlement of $48,000, described as a reasonable recognition of your contributed interest over the period of residency. I looked at the number. I looked at Clara. Clara looked at me. My client will need time to consider, Clara said. We left. In the car, I said, "What's the property worth?" Clara said, "Based on current comps in that area, somewhere between $400,000 and $440,000. Possibly higher depending on the lot." $48,000 was, in rough terms, 11 cents on the dollar of my legal ownership interest in a property I had co-signed, co-maintained the paperwork for, and lived in for 3 years before being handed a notice to vacate across a breakfast table. "No," I said. "That's my recommendation as well," Clara said. The negotiation that followed took 2 more months. I will not walk you through every exchange because most of it was procedural. Letters between attorneys, revised proposals, the slow administrative grinding of people who have overplayed a hand trying to find a face-saving exit. What I will tell you is that at no point did Henryk Voss acknowledge directly, to me or through his attorney, that he had been wrong about what the deed said. The closest he came was a letter, drafted by his attorney, that included the phrase, "It appears there was a misunderstanding regarding the recorded instrument following the 2021 refinancing," which is one way to describe opening a manila envelope from the county recorder's office and actually reading what's inside it. The settlement we reached in January, signed by both parties, witnessed, filed, was not $48,000. I am not going to tell you the exact number because Clara advised me not to and because the number is not actually the point. What I will tell you is that it was sufficient, that it was a real acknowledgement of what a co-owner's interest in a $400,000 property is actually worth. That when I signed the quitclaim deed, which I signed willingly because I did not want the house, had never wanted the house, wanted only what the house represented in a legal and financial accounting of 3 years of my life, I signed it in a conference room with Clara on one side of the table and Gregor's attorney on the other, and Gregor himself sitting slightly apart from his attorney with his hands folded, not quite meeting my eyes. Henryk was not there. His attorney represented him, by proxy. I signed. I dated it. I capped my pen. Clara slid the file into her bag. I shook the opposing attorney's hand. I nodded at Gregor. And then I walked out of that conference room and down a hallway and through a glass door and out into the January air, which was cold and bright and smelled like the city does after a night of rain. I drove to Petra's, where I was still staying, and I sat in her kitchen and she made tea, and we didn't talk about it much. There wasn't that much to say. The paperwork had said what needed to be said. I've thought in the time since about why Henryk did what he did. I don't mean the transfer attempt. I understand that one clearly enough. I mean the original notice. The way he sat across from me at that table and slid that paper across with the particular confidence of a man who has already decided the outcome. I think he genuinely did not know. I think he had reviewed the summary of the refinancing, confirmed the rate and the term, and never read the deed instrument that resulted from it. I think, in his mental accounting of the household, I had never been an owner, and so the document that said otherwise was invisible to him. Not hidden, not concealed. Just invisible, the way things are invisible when you've already decided what the picture looks like. He had managed commercial properties for decades. He knew how title worked. And he still slid that paper across the table with absolute confidence. That is the part one keep returning to. Not the cruelty of it, exactly, but the certainty. You were always a guest. Filed. Settled, decided. The deed had a second name. It had always had a second name. It waited, in that county records file, the way quiet things wait, without urgency, without grievance, without any need to announce itself. Until the moment someone tried to act as though it didn't exist. And then it simply was what it was. I moved into my own apartment in February. 3rd floor, east-facing windows. A view of a street with old linden trees that I was told went green in a particular shade in the spring. I signed my own lease, wrote my own name on it, put a copy in my files. I run in the mornings still. I go to work. I think, becoming someone who is easier to be. My friend Simone asked me once, about a month after the settlement, whether I ever wanted to say something to Henryk, to call him, or send a letter, or find some way to make sure he understood what had happened. I thought about it seriously, which is how I try to think about things. No, I said. I think he understood it fine. There's a thing I've noticed in the years I've spent working with contracts and instruments and recorded documents about the way quiet records function. They don't argue. They don't plead their case or raise their voice or lobby for recognition. They sit in their proper place in the proper system, and they mean what they mean, and when the moment comes, they say so. I have tried, in the years I've been building my life, to be something like that. Not passive. That's the wrong word. Patient. Certain of what I know. Willing to let the records speak rather than spending myself trying to convince people who have already decided. Henryk Voss was certain of what he knew. He knew who belonged in that house and who had always been a guest. He had decades of experience in property management, a lifelong respect for documentation, and absolute confidence in his own accounting of the situation. He just hadn't read the deed. That's my story. One breakfast table, one folded paper, and one county records file that had been sitting quietly in its proper place for 3 years. If you were sitting in that conference room in January, watching me sign the quitclaim, watching Gregor not quite meet my eyes, what would you have done differently? Would you have pushed back sooner, or would you have waited, the way I did, and let the paperwork answer? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.